When I was a kid, I grew up in the Philadelphia area. We lived there from 1960 through 72, actually, 1972. And one of the TV stations in Philly was Channel 48 WKBS. It was one of the first independent stations, not the first, but one of the first independent stations in Philly. You know, Philly for so many years just had the 3 networks and an educational station, and all of a sudden 1729-48 came on the air, and we had all these reruns and cool stuff. Anyway, Channel 48 was owned by this company called Kaiser Broadcasting. I forget where they were based out of, Chicago or somewhere like that. Anyway, or somewhere, I don't remember, but it doesn't matter. And I never knew this, but apparently they had a news department back in the late 60s, and they had hired a young man named Jim Vance to do news for them. I never remember seeing any news on Channel 48. It was all Star Trek reruns and My Mother the Car and whatever. Like, that's what I saw on there. So then, anyway, we moved down here to the D.C. area in 1972, and I immediately gravitated to 2 TV stations, okay? I think my favorite station was then Channel 9 WTOP television. Gordon Peterson, Warner Wolf, really good. You know, Maureen Bunyan, J.C. Hayward, Max Robinson. And I also liked Channel 4, although I think I was partial to Channel 9 at the time. Channel 4, it was Jim Vance. Now, Jim Vance came down to Washington in 1969, worked as a reporter at Channel 4 for a number of years, and then became a top anchor. And he was paired with a guy named Glenn Rinker. So, D.C., you know, back in, even through the 60s, you rarely, almost never saw a black man anchoring a newscast. Or even reporting at a TV station. That was rare. You just didn't. You know, your anchors were always white, pretty much always white men. Very few women were even anchors back then. It was always a white man. And that's through the 60s. And then finally the 70s started to happen. And D.C. was always a step or two ahead of a lot of other markets in terms of that integration thing. And Channel 9 had Gordon Peterson and Max Robinson. And Channel 4 had Jim Vance and Glenn Rinker. And they were 2 of the first interracial anchor teams in the country. Maybe the first, I don't know. But I do remember watching both of those stations and thinking, you know, they both had really good news departments. Channel 9 over the years is... You know what's happened if you live in Washington for any length of time. Channel 9's, you know, the Washington Post used to own Channel 9. They sold Channel 9. It's gone. It's goofy news now. Gordon Peterson, of course, went over to Channel 7 for a number of years, and then he retired, and Max Robinson had a very tragic death. Anyway, but then we had Channel 4. And over the years, through I think from the 80s into the 90s to today, Channel 4 has been pretty much the news leader on Washington television. And one of the main reasons for that is Jim Vance. He was just, he's like the perfect anchor. He can, you know, he has a charm about him. He can be funny. He can be serious. He's always been an integral part of DC and DC TV and the local DC TV news. He's just like, you know, anybody who's grown up in Washington, anybody who's lived here for more than a couple years, Jim Vance is part of your life. It's just the way it is. And we, you know, we knew this day was coming. I honestly thought he'd retire before he passed away. I did not know he would, you know, we knew he was not well, but, you know, he did come out a couple of months ago on the air saying, hey, I have cancer. You know, I'm going to keep working as best I can. And, you know, Jim has been through the ringer, okay? Not only, you know, was he one of the best TV anchors in the country, he went through a lot of personal stuff. You know, I don't think he's kept it secret, but he had a drug problem, and he's had some problems in his life, personal problems, and he's overcome them all, and he's maintained that high quality of local news objectivity. And yet, he's always had a heart in it. You know, he always could put a spin on it that, you know, hey, I'm not just an anchor talking down to you. I'm part of the community too. You know, he had that ability to do that. And that's why everybody liked Jim Vance. I don't think you hear anybody, you know, there's some people in the Washington market, there's a few people, there's a couple of people, not many, but there's a few people in the DC media market that nobody ever says anything bad about, you know, because they are honestly good people, and that was Jim Vance. He was always good people. Channel 4 is, I think, you know, I have a tough time watching local TV news these days. But I still can watch Channel 4. They still have an objectivity there. They still have a class about them. You don't feel like they're slanting the news to the left or the right or wherever. They're not over, you know, they're not, and everybody hypes, but, you know, they keep it to a minimum. Their people over there always seem to be like part of the community and real, and Jim was always like that. He was real, you know, and he had, you know, if he got mad, he'd get mad. I mean, you know, he would tell people out about the Redskins name or certain things. He would do editorials in that almost old-fashioned style. You know, he wasn't afraid to let his opinion out there, even if it was not necessarily popular. That pairing, that, you know, everybody loves that pairing of the anchorman and the big sports guy. You know, we had that back in the day with Glenn Brenner and Gordon Peterson over at Channel 9, and of course, Glenn Brenner tragically passed away in '92. And then we had that too at Channel 4 with, you know, with that dream anchor team. Remember that? I mean, we had I guess you could put that down as the dream anchor team at Channel 4. Jim Vance, George Michael on sports, Willard originally, and then Bob Ryan on the weather. And, of course, Doreen Gensler as his longtime news partner there, anchor. That's kind of like about as dream team local TV news as it gets. And Jim got, you know, great rapport with all of them, especially George Michael. George and Jim, some nights would just knock your socks off. Totally knock your socks off. What do you say? What do you say about a guy in this day and age who's worked at the same station continuously for almost 50 years? I mean, it just doesn't happen. You know, you hear a lot of people that have been in TV news for 3 or 4 decades, but never at the same station. You know, they've bounced around 5 or 6 different stations, different markets, whatever. You know, and it's very rare to see somebody come to Washington in 1969, WRC Channel 4, and still be there almost 50 years later. Amazing. An amazing career and an amazing man. Rest in peace, Jim Vance.